The controversy around vaccinations is one of the most passionate issues of our time. On the one side, we have the medical establishment, the government, and the media, all enthusiastically claiming that vaccinations are a universal good thing that promotes the health of the individual and the strength of the herd. On the other hand, we have a growing number of parents and health professionals who disagree and feel that vaccines are not essential, especially when the potential harm they are causing is so profound. This short presentation will cover a small fraction of the truth that is behind this debate. To start, let's look at the 6 basic claims that are almost unanimously accepted as truth by most medical doctors. Infectious diseases killed many people in the past, mostly children. This no longer happens because of vaccinations. If people stop vaccinating their children, then these diseases will return and start killing people. Smallpox and polio were eradicated in the United States due to vaccinations. Flu shots have made a significant difference in treating influenza. Parents who do not vaccinate their children are putting all children at risk because they are weakening the herd. Vaccinations are, for the most part, safe. The small percentage that are harmed is well worth the lives that have been saved. The science is in. Vaccinations are safe and effective. You would have to be crazy or anti-science to be against them. Before we look at the diseases that have been addressed with vaccinations, let's look at 4 of the diseases that killed millions of children in the past that never had a vaccine: tuberculosis, typhoid, scarlet fever, and scurvy. As you can see, from 1860 to 1960, the death rate from tuberculosis went from around 350 per 100,000 to less than 10. In 1907, the death rate from typhoid was about 30 per 100,000 and went to 0 by 1950. Scarlet fever killed from 40 to 140 per 100,000 before 1880. Then it dropped to almost 0 by 1940. Scurvy is a disease which we now know is related to a deficiency of vitamin C. Notice the graph is very similar to the curves for these other 3 infections. As these graphs make clear, all 4 of these diseases saw drastic reductions in deaths over the last 100 years. How can this reduction be explained? The 1800s and 1900s saw a huge improvement in several important public health issues. Proper treatment of sewage so food and drinking water was not contaminated. Regulation and testing of drinking water for harmful pathogens and chemicals. Regulation and testing of foods for harmful pathogens and spoilage. Refrigeration of food to prevent spoilage and growth of pathogens. Adult labor laws to reduce the hours worked per day and per week. Elimination of child labor through progressive labor laws. It is well established in the field of public health that improved living conditions were responsible for the significant reduction of these diseases and dramatically increasing life expectancy. Tuberculosis, typhoid, scarlet fever, and scurvy were almost completely eliminated without the use of vaccines through better hygiene, improvement of living and working conditions, and better nutrition. Now let's take a look at the history of smallpox. As you can see in the graph, smallpox was a disease that came in waves. There were several outbreaks in the mid-1800s, with the worst being around 1873. In 1855, strict vaccination laws were passed, and yet, as the graph demonstrates, there were still several outbreaks. The city of Leicester was specifically hit hard in the epidemic of 1873. As a result, the citizens elected to repeal the mandatory vaccination law for their city. The blue line shows that 100% of registered births were vaccinated in 1873, and this dropped to almost 0 in the 1890s. Instead of mass vaccination, the city used a strategy of surveillance and containment. Leicester was a large manufacturing town with a population of almost 250,000. This policy went on for 60 years, and during that entire time, they had the lowest percentage of babies and adults vaccinated, and also the lowest death rate from smallpox in all of England. Several facts about smallpox that are not well known are, after 1900, smallpox became a much less virulent disease. Less than 10% of the population of the world was ever vaccinated for smallpox. According to Dr. Tom Mack, a smallpox expert with the CDC, even without mass vaccinations, smallpox would have died out anyway. This data shows that the smallpox vaccine was not responsible for the eradication of smallpox. It may have played a part, but was certainly not primarily responsible for this happening. Now let's take a look at polio. Unlike these other infections, polio was almost unknown before 1880. It gradually increased for about 60 years and then took off in the 1940s. The height of the polio epidemic was in 1952. So unlike the other infections we have looked at, it was not caused by poor living conditions. For many people growing up in the 1950s, due to an aggressive media campaign, polio became synonymous with paralysis, iron lungs, and ugly braces on cute children. While it is certainly true that there were cases of people with these serious complications, the truth was much less dire. Some of the facts about polio. The poliovirus infection has no symptoms up to 95% of the time. Between 4 to 8% of polio infections consist of a minor illness indistinguishable from the flu. Between 1 and 2% have stiffness in the neck, back, and legs with a complete recovery within 2 to 10 days. Fewer than 1% of all polio infections result in paralysis, and of this number, many recover completely. As you can see in this graph, following the blue line, the height of the polio outbreak was around 1952. The orange line shows when the polio vaccine was implemented, and you can see that polio was trending downward way before the vaccine. As the dotted line shows, there seems to be a correlation between the amount of pesticides produced and the cases of polio. Polio is a neurological disease, and pesticides are known neurological toxins. It is also interesting that around 1952 is when DDT was beginning to be phased out. This connection was never properly investigated. The points to remember about polio. Polio is not synonymous with paralysis. Polio incidence was dropping in the U.S. before the release of the polio vaccine. There have been no cases of polio in the Western Hemisphere since 1991. So while the vaccine has reduced the number of cases of polio, it was already on its way down, and it was never as bad as the media campaign made it out to be. The next vaccine that we will look at was originally called the DPT and is now called the DTaP, and it addresses the diseases of diphtheria, pertussis or whooping cough, and tetanus. As you can see in this graph, the deaths from diphtheria were coming down dramatically, just like the other non-vaccine diseases that we looked at. There was an antitoxin developed in 1894 and a vaccine developed in 1920, but it was not widely used until later. Something else was responsible for the huge reduction in diphtheria deaths. This graph shows a similar reduction in the number of deaths from whooping cough over the last 100 years. You can see how low the number was when the pertussis vaccine was implemented in the late 1940s. Again, it is clear that the vaccine was not responsible for this dramatic reduction. Here is an example of how the data is manipulated to give a certain impression. This graph is shown to demonstrate the effectiveness of the tetanus vaccine. It clearly shows the significant reduction in the number of cases. But if we go back further, by following the blue line, you can see that this reduction was happening before the introduction of the vaccine. The arrow shows when the tetanus vaccine was introduced. As far as effectiveness goes, from 1998 to 2000, there were only 130 reported cases of tetanus, and 20 of them were fully immunized. The facts about tetanus are: tetanus is a harmless bacteria when exposed to oxygen. The best way to prevent tetanus is proper wound care. Tetanus comes from horse and cow feces, which is much less present now than it was 100 years ago. Tetanus has never killed large numbers of people. In 1900, the death rate was 4 in every 100,000, compared to TB, which was 194. In 1935, it was down to 1 in every 100,000. Even properly vaccinated people can get tetanus. If a person gets tetanus, there are modern medicines that can treat it, like antibiotics and tetanus immune globulin. Let's look at the history of measles. As this graph makes very clear, while measles was deadly for many children in the early 1900s, the death rate from measles was almost at zero when the vaccine was introduced. Deaths from measles had decreased by 96% before the implementation of the measles vaccine. In 1963, the year that the measles vaccine was introduced for the New England states, the death rate from measles was 5, compared to 283 from asthma, 4,679 from accidents, and 47,804 from heart disease. Before the development of the measles vaccine, this disease was seen as a normal part of childhood. It was not considered a dreaded disease. In fact, most pediatricians would suggest that if a child got measles, that all of the children in the neighborhood should come over for a measles party, so they would get infected and get the disease over with. And yet, with the recent outbreak of measles at Disneyland, it is implied that this is a dreaded disease that needs to be feared and quarantined. The measles vaccine has clearly lowered the incidence of measles. This is true of several of the vaccines. But as these graphs show, the death rate for measles and other infections was a small fraction of what it had been. Flu is short for influenza. The yearly flu shot has become a part of the American culture. Many businesses require their employees to get a yearly flu shot, and many health workers are threatened with loss of job if they do not comply. Let's look at the history of the incidence of influenza. As you can see from this graph, except for the flu epidemic of 1918, the incidence of deaths from influenza was significantly dropping in line with the deaths from tuberculosis. This was long before the implementation of the flu shot. So how effective are flu shots? For children 6 to 24 months, a review of 51 studies and 294,000 children concluded that the flu shot was no more effective than placebo. 800 children with asthma were studied, and there was no evidence that the flu shot was of any benefit in preventing exacerbations to asthma. In fact, children who got the flu shot were 3 times more at risk for hospitalization. How about adults? In a review of 48 studies of 66,000 adults, flu shots reduced risk of the flu by 6%. There was no reduction in the hospital visits or the need to take time off work. How about our seniors? In a review of 64 studies, it was concluded that flu shots were insignificant for preventing flu or pneumonia in the elderly. So here we have a vaccine that costs billions of dollars and which has shown very little effectiveness for every age group. In addition, each flu shot has the following additives which can cause possible reactions: Formaldehyde, a carcinogen. Tributyl phosphate, a carcinogen. Polysorbate 80 or tween 80 can cause neurological harm and immune reactions. Thimerosal mercury. Yes, even though it has been phased out of other vaccines, it is still used in the flu shot. Other vaccinations that are on the recommended vaccine schedule. Mumps, a childhood disease associated with swollen salivary glands and high fevers, usually goes away in about 10 days. German measles is a mild childhood infection, sometimes called 3-day measles. If caught by a pregnant woman, it increased their risk of fetal birth defects. Hepatitis A, in most cases, is not a serious illness. Symptoms include diarrhea, flu-like symptoms, maybe some jaundice. Once it is over, the person has lifetime immunity. Hepatitis B is another viral infection that most people have little or no symptoms and then acquire lifetime immunity. Only about 1% develop chronic liver disease and possibly cancer 10 to 30 years after the infection. This infection is caught through the blood, sharing needles and anal sex. The vaccine gives about 10 years of protection, and yet we give this to newborn babies. Why give a child a vaccine that will no longer be effective at the time that they might actually be at risk for the disease? Chickenpox is a mild childhood infection that most people over the age of 30 had with no complications as a child and then had lifetime immunity. In the last 30 years, there has been a dramatic increase in the number of cases of shingles, a very painful disease caused by a virus closely related to the chickenpox virus. Shingles can cause severe long-term pain. There's no explanation of why shingles is on the rise, but it's suggested that it could be because of the chickenpox vaccination, which does not give lifetime immunity. Rotavirus is a virus that is not deadly but causes diarrhea and potential dehydration in young children. Reactions to the vaccine include serious intestinal problems. HIV is a specific type of influenza. With modern medical procedures, influenza is not a serious risk. Pneumonia is a bacterial infection that for most people is not a serious risk if treated properly with modern medical procedures. Much has been made about how the people who are choosing not to vaccinate their children are weakening the herd. In the 1930s, it was observed that when the percentage of children who had gotten over measles reached a certain level, then the occurrence of measles went way down. When the percentage dropped, the occurrence began to rise. This was the first time the term herd immunity was used. This well-documented phenomenon was based on a disease that gave lifetime immunity once a person had it. The natural immunity that was acquired by getting the disease contributed to this herd immunity. This has never been proven in regards to the temporary immunity that vaccinations give. In fact, a case could be made that the unvaccinated child that gets the disease and has lifetime immunity actually strengthens the herd more than a child that has temporary immunity from a vaccine. And if the vaccines are so effective, why would anyone who has chosen to vaccinate their child care? So it is clear that some of the generally accepted ideas about vaccination are not true. At the same time, it's important to give vaccines their due. Vaccines have reduced the incidence of many childhood diseases. Vaccines have saved lives through this reduction. If vaccines were safe, then their overall benefit would be unquestionable. So the question we will now investigate is, are they safe? First of all, let's look at how vaccines are tested for safety. For all other medications, a new drug is tested against a placebo, like a sugar pill or saline. If the side effects of the drug are too much compared to the placebo, then the drug is not considered safe. But vaccines are not tested against the placebo. The number of reactions of a new vaccine is compared to an existing vaccine that has been determined to be safe. In other words, once a vaccine has been accepted by the medical authorities as safe, then it can be used as a comparison for a new vaccine. Another issue with vaccine testing is that studies include data from a few thousand healthy children. Any child who has a neurological disease, asthma, eczema, or any other altered immune function is excluded from the test. But after the vaccine is approved, it is recommended for all children, including the ones that have conditions that were excluded from the initial testing. Side effects from the vaccine are also monitored for 5 to 15 days. It is well documented that autoimmune conditions can take months or years to develop. Then there is the massive contradiction regarding liability for those children who have severe and life-altering reactions. On the one hand, the pharmaceutical companies and the CDC claim that the vaccines are safe except for a very small number of bad reactions. On the other hand, they pressured Congress in 1986 to pass a law which gives blanket liability protection to the pharmaceutical company and the physician. They created VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. Approximately 11,000 adverse events are reported to VAERS each year. 15% are considered serious because it necessitated a trip to the emergency room, required hospitalization, or resulted in a permanent disability. And this is a voluntary reporting system. Many medical doctors have a bias in favor of protecting the vaccination program and tend to downplay any adverse events or imply that it was something else that caused it. There could be thousands of more events that are never reported. In the period of mid-1999 to January 2004, 2,093 deaths were reported that occurred soon after vaccination. Again, the number could be much higher. These are not insignificant numbers. And when you consider the earlier graphs that showed that deaths from all of these diseases were way down before vaccinations, it makes one wonder if they are worth it. Drug companies and the CDC know that these adverse events are much more common than is believed. That is why they sought protection from Congress. Even though vaccines may have benefit for some, it is clear that they have created serious problems for others. Adverse events at the time of vaccination are easy to document. But what about the long-term effects to our children? This is much harder to measure. Let's look at the overall trend in health of our children over the past several decades. As you can see in this graph, asthma incidence has been going up. In 1960, for children 0 to 4, the incidence was around 4 per 10,000. This went up to around 100 per 10,000 by 1990. This is a 25-fold increase. This graph shows the increase in obesity. 5% of children were considered obese in the early 1970s. This has increased to around 15% by 2010, a 3-fold increase. This shows the increase in diabetic health contexts doubling from 2006 to 2012. Finally, this dramatic graph shows how the incidence of autism has gone from 1 in 5,000 in 1975 to 1 in 88 in 2012. This is over a 50-fold increase. Something is causing this serious decline in the health of our children. Because these problems are related to the immune system, and because the number of recommended vaccinations has gone up and up over the last 50 years, it is certainly a possibility that there is a connection. Before 1960, children got the smallpox, polio, and DPT vaccinations. By 1985, children were getting 18 different vaccines by the age of 6 months and 33 by the age of 5. By 2003, this had increased to 51 by the age of 6 months and 77 by the age of 5. In 2010, a child would receive 66 different vaccines, many of them combined into one shot by the age of 6 months, and 110 by the age of 5. Thanks to vaccines, we have very few cases anymore of polio, measles, mumps, German measles, diphtheria, whooping cough, tetanus, chickenpox, and hepatitis A and B. But the number of children with asthma, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and autism has skyrocketed. If there is even a slight chance that the vaccinations are contributing to these problems, shouldn't vaccines be vigorously investigated instead of making the people who question them into quacks and nutjobs? So who is making these recommendations and vaccination schedules? The Center for Disease Control, or CDC, is the government organization that oversees all issues regarding diseases. Within the CDC, the ACIP, or Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, is the group that makes these decisions. Many of the members of this committee have financial connections with the drug companies that make the vaccines. They have a definite financial conflict of interest in finding these vaccines safe and recommending more and more of them. There are numerous academic studies that have proven that when there is a financial conflict of interest, the results of a scientific study are more likely to be suspect. Much is made in the media about how it has been proven that there is no link between mercury, the MMR vaccine, and autism. But all of these studies were funded or conducted by groups that have a conflict of interest. And even if the results are valid, this is just evidence that one vaccination may not be responsible for one specific problem. It is not scientific confirmation that all vaccines are safe. Let's go back and review the original claims. It is not true that vaccines were responsible for a major reduction in the death rates of many dreaded diseases of the past. Improvements on hygiene and living conditions were the primary cause of this reduction. If people stopped vaccinating their children, we would not go back to the death rates we saw 100 years ago. The death rates for these diseases were under control before vaccinations, and they would continue to be under control if we stopped, just like tuberculosis, typhoid, and scarlet fever. Flu shots are simply not effective at significantly preventing the flu. This is true in all age groups. People who refuse vaccinations are not putting the herd at risk. The herd is not really at risk, and vaccinations don't give the same quality of immunity as is achieved by naturally getting over the infection. While it is not clear why it is happening, there are profound negative health changes happening at an unbelievably rapid rate to our children. The science is definitely not in. All of the science may be suspect because it has been conducted or sponsored by drug companies or government agencies that have a conflict of interest. What about anecdotal evidence? While not being proof one way or the other, this type of evidence can't be ignored. There are many parents who have both vaccinated and unvaccinated children. Many of these parents report better overall health for their unvaccinated children. These unvaccinated kids are less likely to get sick, have more vitality and energy, and are less susceptible to behavioral and learning problems than their vaccinated siblings. Dr. Meyer Eisenstein started a home birth practice in Chicago in the 1970s. In his own words, we have about 30,000 or 35,000 children that we've taken care of over the years, and I don't think we have a single case of autism in children delivered by us who never received vaccines. And there are also reports from Amish communities that don't vaccinate their children. The occurrence of autism is similar to the national rate 50 years ago before the huge increase in the number of vaccinations. Are vaccine deniers anti-science like the climate change deniers? In the climate change debate, those who deny climate change have a financial conflict of interest because they work for the energy industry. But in the vaccine debate, those with a financial conflict of interest are the ones recommending the vaccines and claiming they are safe. Those brave doctors who have come out partially or totally against the current vaccination program suffer for their views. They can lose their jobs and be ridiculed by their colleagues and the press. There is no question that vaccines have helped to save lives of some children, but most of these diseases were already getting under control or were never a serious health risk. If there were no safety issues, even saving a small number of lives by vaccines would be great. But there are many reactions to vaccinations. Our government has passed laws to give blanket liability protection to the drug companies and doctors that administer them. There is no explanation for the rapid increase of autism, asthma, obesity, and other conditions. Vaccines must be investigated as a possible cause. We can't trust the CDC. They are rife with conflict of interest. Our family doctors are well-intentioned, but they are too busy to research themselves and are just following the CDC guidelines. How do we resolve this issue once and for all? An independent study needs to be done comparing a large number of unvaccinated and vaccinated children and adults for the incidence of autism, obesity, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, behavioral and learning disabilities, drug abuse, and depression. This will either prove once and for all that vaccinations are safe or prove that they are not. Until that time, every parent should have the right to decide whether or not to vaccinate their children. If you would like to research this more on your own, here are some resources that were used to create this presentation.